Hi friends, Mindy here. I have a little process video for you today. I am going to be using this stencil. This is the sunflower stencil from Bythewell4god that coordinated with the kit Who You Are this month. And I know that this stencil is sold out, and so I do apologize for that, but I wanted to share some techniques with this stencil. I was asked in my unboxing if I could share different ways that we could use this stencil, but I do think if you're just looking for some fall vibes, I know that they do have like the Dahlia stencil, I believe, still available, and you could certainly do something like these techniques very similarly with that particular stencil. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just very basic. I'm working in my altered book here. This is how I'm working through the devotional this month, and so I'm just opening to this first page, which just happened to be blank, so that was perfect. And I'm going to just stencil this on with some Distress Oxide colors. I am using Scattered Straw and Fossilized Amber here, and I just wanted a really subtle look, and I'm using just a blending brush. This is not my typical one. These are the distress ones so they're a little bit scratchier, but they still work. You could use makeup blenders as well. And then I'm going to go in for the centers with some Vintage Photo, and I'm trying to be very careful over on that right side. I want that stencil design to just sort of blend into the rest of the page, sort of to bleed through. I don't want to have that harsh edge from the end of the stencil, and so I'm just kind of randomly avoiding that edge, if that makes sense. This is going in now with some of that Fossilized Amber. It's just a really warm, beautiful color, and just holding the stencil in place while I do this, going over the random places. Obviously, I'm not concerned if some of my Vintage Photo gets over into the sunflower, I want this to be a very subtle background, and obviously this was not quite as tall as my book, so I'm going to sort of try to add a little bit of stenciling down at the bottom. I did not get this as lined up as I had hoped, which is fine because I'll probably end up putting some pattern paper or a pocket or something down there anyway, but this will just at least give that motif down there at the bottom as well. And I did purposely try to keep some areas that were really light and faded and some that had more color, just to give that stenciling a little bit more interest. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm working on a piece of deli paper just to collect all of my mess. And this is a really fun technique because it ends up making it look a lot like watercolor. So what I'm doing is taking the distress crayons and I am rubbing them onto a wet baby wipe, and I'm just rubbing that through the stencil. So in the end, this will kind of bleed and fade through here just a little bit. You can see even the brown is kind of going out into the leaves. That just gives it a little bit more dimension, but this is just going to make this really look like watercolor. So this first color that I'm doing here, this yellow color, is actually mustard seed. This is a really bright yellow color. And I'm just going through this same process, and then I'm going to add in again some Fossilized Amber just to kind of warm up those colors. Mustard seed is a very bright color, as you can see here. And then there's some things that we can do with this after this has all dried too. Trying to also vary where I'm putting this Fossilized Amber. I'm kind of tapping it in instead of kind of rubbing it in, because I want to give just a little bit of texture to those leaves. And also I don't want to blend into the color and then just make a new color. I'm really trying to keep the variation of color. So you can kind of see how this looks now. This is just a watercolor kind of look, and I did another one of these but with just a lighter hand of color, and I think I'll show that at the end. But the next thing that I'm going to do is go back to my little blenders here and go through that same process. I'm going to do a technique, but in order to get it to kind of work, you have to be working with the reverse side of the stencil. This will make sense in a minute, but if you can see the way that the stencil is lined up right now, I'm working from the back to the front because I'm going to end up using the front of this stencil as kind of a stamp here in a minute. So I'm going back through same colors. I'm using Scattered Straw and Fossilized Amber, Distress Oxide. I'm going through with my little blenders here, and then I will add some Vintage Photo for the centers as well, just keeping that stencil in place while I do all of this. And again, I want there to be color kind of out in the other areas of the leaves and petals and things, just to make it, just to give it a little bit more interest and cohesive. So I'm just going through and doing all of that. And you can see now kind of just how that stencils with this particular brush. So now I'm going to clean off the back side of this stencil, because again, remember, I'm working on the reverse side here. And now I'm going to flip the stencil to the right side, and I am going to basically print the negative space of this stencil. So I am going to take the Distress Oxide color in, I believe I used ground espresso, and I'm going to now use this like a stamp. So I'm adding this right over the top of the plastic part of the stencil. So I'm working on another little piece of deli paper here, and then I'm going to very carefully, as carefully as I can, really line this up over the top of this stencil to get that ink in between like the negative space of this stencil, if that makes sense. I'm going to take a brayer and just rub over this. Now, you could certainly hit this with some water if you wanted to. I did not do that, and I'll show you why. That was Scott. He says hello. If you watch Hubby Dubs, you know he's been liking to show up lately. Anyway, so I love how this image turned out. This is probably my favorite tag out of all of the ones that I made. There's just something really cool about how it imprinted. It's an imperfect process, so if that's not your thing, just keep that in mind. But what I did, because I still have all that ink on that stencil, I sprayed it down, misted it a little bit with some water, and I'm going to do the same exact thing. And now I'm going to basically stamp the background of this stencil. And then I'm going to let this dry, and we'll come back to it and do some other things to it. But for right now, you can kind of see how that works. And if you wanted that more perfect look, you could have, I could have done that on the first stamping as well. But I really liked the kind of, I don't know, it just made it look really interesting. So here I have decided to do one of my favorite techniques, or trying to do this, but I was going to use some crackle paste, and my crackle paste from Tim Holtz is nearly dried out. So at this point, I wasn't actually sure if this was going to work, and I only left it in here because it did, but I was able to add a little bit of water to that texture paste. It's still very, very thick, as you can see. It's very difficult to spread. And so I would be careful to do this with like a super fragile stencil, but I just happened to try to get, add some water to kind of reconstitute it. And at this point I was like, well, we'll just see what happens. But this is the crackle paste. I really love how white stenciling looks on craft cardstock. I think it's just really fun, and especially in the fall, I will do it a lot. I just really like how it looks. So even if it doesn't crackle, it was such a good impression that I'm just going to leave it to the side, and we'll see what happens. It just, it will crackle over time. So now I'm going to go in that same process here, but with my light and fluffy modeling paste. And this is from the Crafter's Workshop. It's just a really nice texture paste to use. I really enjoy it. It's one of my favorites. I use it all the time when I'm doing this, just because it's really light, especially like if you're using it in your Bible page. It's not too heavy. It stays flexible to a certain extent, and so it's just a lot of fun to use. So again, you could leave this just like it is right here, and I personally think it's beautiful because, again, I really love the white on craft look. But we're going to add a little bit of interest to this. Now, this next technique is not for everybody. It's also a very imperfect technique, so keep that in mind. And you've probably seen me do it before because it's one of my favorite things to do, actually. But I am just taking some embossing glaze and going over the wet texture paste, and this is going to be kind of an imperfect process, and I don't have as many of the Distress embossing glazes as I do other products, so I'm using antique linen here, and then I have mustard seed. Those are the colors that I have, and so you kind of see a lot of contrast here, but when it gets heated up with the craft, it will make more sense. But it kind of looks a little scary right here, but that's okay. Now, obviously, when you're doing this particular technique, you're not going to be able to put those colors back into their jars, so I will actually save this little party mix of color and use it in other things. In fact, I did another stencil with it after I turned off the camera, but I'm going to let that sit to dry because you need to let the texture paste dry before you can heat up the glaze on there. So we're going to set that off to the side to dry. And now we're back with some of the Crafter's Workshop light and fluffy modeling paste and some of the distress crayons, and I'm going to use those distress crayons to color this texture paste. So I started off with ground espresso just immediately because I need a darker color, because you're mixing all these colors with white. Obviously they're going to be lighter, so I did add in some vintage photo as well, and this will become the center of my little stencil, or of my little sunflowers here. So I'm just going to very carefully apply this. Again, this is not a perfect technique. You could certainly you know, take the time and like mask off the sections if you wanted to. That's not for me. And I like it, again, when some of those colors kind of bleed out into the rest of the image. I just think that gives it more interest. So I'm just applying this to those areas of the centers of the sunflowers. And then I'll use that excess, I'll put that on some other paper for another project. And then I'm going to use a couple of different colors here for the yellow. So again, I'm using, I have scattered straw, and I have mustard seed and fossilized amber. And then I did add just a little bit of antique linen in there as well, just to kind of soften it just a bit. And I am mixing this, and it's hard to see on camera, but I didn't mix it to completely to a new color. So there are still like variations of each of those colors within this texture paste. I was just trying to give this a little bit more dimension this way. Sometimes texture paste, when you're done with, can kind of have flat look to it, and there's certainly ways that you can, you know, even color that after the fact. This, like I said, is not going to be an exhaustive list of all of the things that you can do with these stencils, because there's a billion things that you can do with stencils. But I was asked to show a few different ways that you could use it, and so I'm trying to show some of my favorite techniques here. So you can kind of see some of those darker, brighter spots of color just from where everything was mixing together. And I know this looks really scary, but I'm just going to peel off that stencil and pull this up, and then I will let that sit to dry, and you can kind of see how that texture looks. And this, I just did this with all of the random leftover bits, and I actually really love how this one turned out too, because it's really kind of distressed and fun looking. So that ended up being a favorite of mine as well. So, you know, don't be afraid to just play. It's just cardstock and, you know, some leftovers. So I wanted to circle back to some of these other tags. So this is that one now that that distress oxide has dried. I'm going to come back through and add some color now. And so I'm going to go back into scattered straw and fossilized amber. I'm going to pull out my little blender and add some color. I'm just going directly over the whole thing, even the background, because it's not going to show up over the top of it. So it just gave it a little bit more interest in doing that. And I will even go over the centers with some vintage photo. And I actually made a point to kind of blend that out from the center into the petals as well, just to give that a little bit more interest. And you can see like there's some fossilized amber in darker places and that kind of stuff on this one. And this is that watercolor stencil, what we did with the baby wipe. And I actually have some antique linen here, and then I'm just hitting the background of this just a little bit to kind of knock back some of that white, just so it's not kind of such a contrast, but I didn't want to lose the color either of the actual sunflowers. So it just kind of made it a little bit more subtle. And this one I'm not touching at all, although you could, even if you wanted to, go back in with a water brush and kind of color in those areas, and it would be fine as well. But I really like how that ended up. Here's how the crackle one turned out. I was surprised that that actually worked. And then this is the one where we have the embossing glaze on it. You can kind of see how it is. Now, technically speaking, you should let this dry all the way. I did not, because what happens when you don't is that it bubbles up, and I really like that look. It actually just gives it some more texture and some more interest. And so I never really let mine dry all the way. But theoretically, if you don't like that, you should let it dry all the way, which can take some time, a few hours even, before you heat that with your heat tool. And that's that one that was kind of the leftover bits. And then I'll give you some close-ups here at the end. But if you liked this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And until next time, bye.